called us to be. So over the last several weeks, I've been sharing with you some different mission opportunities that are on the horizon for us, and using the catchphrase of the Seattle Seahawks, who said, "Why not us?" And they used that phrase to propel them to become the world champions. So we're using it to propel ourselves to become a world-changing church. So a few weeks ago, I brought our boys up front here, and I talked about some of the challenges that our boys face in the 21st century. And I said, somebody needs to step up and change the storyline of our boys, and I asked the question, why not us? 2 weeks ago, we brought our girls up, and we talked about some of the great things that our girls experience here in the 21st century, and also talked about many of the challenges that they face. And I said, somebody needs to step up into these girls' lives and call them to follow Jesus, because there are so many destructive voices our girls are listening to today. Someone needs to stand up and help our girls hear the call of Jesus. Why not us? Then last week, we talked about our work over at the mobile home park, and how for generations, Christians have believed that the gospel really does transform, and that the gospel can break negative dysfunctions in families and transform entire families and entire communities. And as we work over there, we're working with a lot of at-risk kids, as is true in a lot of neighborhoods. There's a lot of despair and dysfunction and addictions there, as there are in other communities. And I said, someone needs to step in the lives of these kids and break that chain that they're living with and give them a story of hope. Why not us? So today what I want to do is look at another why not us, actually 3 why not us's, if us's is a word, and speak in some broad terms for a little bit today about where we are and why this transition is important. Every church that does what we have done, builds buildings, ultimately goes through this particular transition, where you've kind of built your buildings for a while, and now it's really time to focus on the mission and ministry in ways that we haven't been able to do so before. And it is one of the most crucial times in the life of a church. Building is important, but building is pretty easy to do because you see it going up. It's when you invest in people and the things that you can't always see where it really becomes important and difficult, because you can't always see it. And this is a time in the life of the church when a church becomes extremely vulnerable, because they become vulnerable financially. And let me explain why that is. When you're starting a church, or when you're building buildings, people are excited about it. It generates its own generosity because you can see the place being built. But once the buildings are built and you begin to settle in, the people who have been giving to the building and giving to the ministry, they look around and they say, wow, look how many people are here now. I don't have to give as much because there are other people to help give. And the new people come in and they say, well, they built this place without my money. And if I don't give money today, I'll bet they have worship next week. They don't need my money. And so what happens for a lot of churches in this transition is that the ministry needs go way up because there are more and more people coming, and the giving stagnates or it begins to decline. And it happens in church after church after church who are going through the transition that we're going through. And so it's a very vulnerable time for churches. And so, like other churches who've been where we are, we're at a crossroads right now. There are 2 different roads we can take. We can either go down the road of nickeling it and diming it, where I have to get up and talk about money all the time because we're always falling behind. How many of you would like to have that happen here? Or we can go down the biblical path and live into a God moment and God's vision and begin to create into our DNA over this next period of transition the DNA of becoming a church of reckless generosity. And there are 3 aspects to a church of reckless generosity I want to touch on very, very quickly. The first is this, that a church of reckless generosity is a church that empowers all of its people, all of us, to live within the blessings that God has given to you. To live within the blessings that God has given to you. We don't live in a culture that lives within the blessings that God has given to us. We live in a culture that wants to live beyond our finances. Almost every day you probably get some credit card in the mail that says, here, spend this, it's going to be free for a while, or buy it on layaway. We live in a government right now that doesn't know how to spell the word budget, let alone put a budget together. And it's just spend, 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 and pretty soon the piper's going to want to be paid, and it's going to crush us. And there are many of us in this congregation who know what crushing debt can do because you've lived it or you're living it. But imagine a church filled with people who are no longer enslaved to their finances, who are living the freedom of living within the blessings that God has given to you. And many of you have experienced that. The joy of living within your means, of managing the finances that God has given to you, and we can be a place to help you do that. Why not? That's what God wants for you, is financial freedom. And so imagine a church where you've got hundreds and hundreds of families who are living financial freedom and the difference it could make in this church and in the lives of people around us. So why not us? Why can't we be a church like that? Secondly, to be a church of reckless generosity means that we're the go-to church when people are hurting. That people know that when they're hurting, or when the community is hurting, or when the world is hurting, that this is the first place they can come to, and we're going to be able to help financially. That we can make a gift that will be significant. That we actually live out our name. Did you know that community of grace really means community of generosity? That's what grace means. That we live into our name. So that whenever something happens, a crisis here in our church or in the community or in the world, we're the first place people go to, because that's a church we know will help us. Now, all churches have sort of ebbs and flows when they're able to do that. And there have been times when we've been able to respond. This is a time when we're not able to respond. Every penny we take in, it goes right into what we've already budgeted. We have no excess right now to help people. But I don't think that's what the kind of church we want to be. That's the season we're in. But I don't think that's really the kind of church we want to be. I think we want to continue to be a church where people know that this is a grace place. It's a place of reckless generosity, and when people need help, this is a place they can come to. So a church of reckless generosity is a church where our members, where we are following Jesus in our finances and we're living financial freedom, where we have the freedom as a church to help those in need. And thirdly, a church of reckless generosity is a church where what we call a tithing congregation. The word tithe means 10%. And to be a tithing congregation means that 51% or more of our households, our giving households, our families, are giving 10% or more of their income to the ministry of God through this place. And the other 49% of us are working toward giving 10%. Right now, if we were to give at the low end of average, meaning if we were to give at the low end of what the average churchgoer gives every weekend, if we gave at the low end, we would be taking in $30,000 a week. Right now, we're averaging about $20,000 a week. We need $25,000 a week. So when I say every penny counts, every penny counts. But imagine what we could do if we were just a little bit below average. Look at what we've done being below average. Imagine if we were just a little bit below average, what God could do through us. If we were giving on the high end of the average giver in the United States of America, we'd be taking in $40,000 to $45,000 a week. That's mission money. That's mission money that right now, mission is on the cutting room floor. And what that means is, God's already provided the financial blessings for us to do the ministry He's called us to. So it's not a money issue, it's a generosity issue. And it's living into this next phase of mission and ministry and becoming people who are people of reckless generosity, a church of reckless generosity. So why not us? Why can't we be a tithing congregation and change the world? So over the last several weeks, I've been meeting with your top giving leaders. The top 200 people in this church. They're basically the 20% who are doing 80% of the giving. These are the people who have been giving to the general fund and have been giving sacrificial gifts over and above their regular giving to the building fund to help us get here and to pay the mortgage. And I've been meeting with them, and I asked them if they would continue to lead us financially for the next 2 years by continuing their commitment to our building fund and the general fund, but our building fund. And this year, giving $400,000, and next year, giving $400,000 over and above our regular giving. Now, that doesn't mean each of us are going to give $400,000. So those certainly, I would encourage you, if you can, to do that. But together, these 200 families are going to give $400,000 this year, $400,000 next year, to cover our mortgage payments, plus they're going to support the general fund. And my promise to them was that if they'll do that, I will work whatever's left of my butt off to inspire you and encourage you to join them. Because we don't want to be a church where 20% of the people do 80% of the giving. We want to be a church where 100% of us are doing what God is calling us to do financially, and we're participating in this family. That's the kind of church we want to be, and why not us? So here's what's going to happen. A couple promises from me to you. First of all, I promised last week that these next 10 years I was going to ask more of you than I've ever asked before. I'm starting today. I'm keeping my promise. I'm asking us to become a tithing congregation. Secondly, I promise you that I'm not going to talk about this issue now over and over again for the next several weeks. Okay? Because we're going to use the next several weeks to pray about it, and I'm going to trust that you love this place enough and you love your Lord enough that you'll join me in praying about how we can be a church of reckless generosity. So, this week you're going to receive a packet in the mail, and I know you're going to want to look at it because Diane has made this beautiful package. It looks great. It's got some great stuff about the church, and it's a prayer invitation to you to simply ask God this question. What percentage of my income do you want me to give to the church this year? That's the only thing I want you to pray about. I'm not going to ask you how much you're going to give. No one's going to know that except Michelle and God. And they're both kind of equal place. I don't know what you give. I'm not asking you to say, what can I give? I'm asking you to pray, God, what do you want me to give? Because if it's something you can give, then you don't need God. God wants you to need Him. So I promise you that if you pray about it, He's going to ask you to give something you cannot do. And that's when you know God's spoken to you. And then I'm going to ask you to trust Him and obey Him on this one. So when we have our celebration together at the end of the month, we're going to have commitment weekend. And I've asked your leaders, the people who are going to give to the building fund on your behalf, I've asked them to bring a card in that tells us how much financially they're going to give. Only Michelle will see that, but we sort of have to know that. If we need to take in $400,000 a year, we sort of need to know where we are. And then all of us are going to have the privilege of bringing a card in on that weekend, and we're going to ask your name and simply what percentage of your income you're going to give to the church. Again, the only one who will see that is Michelle. And why are we going to ask you for the percentage? Because if we're going to become a church, a tithing church, and 51% of us is the goal, and then move beyond that, we need to know how many people are tithing. It's just a way for us to report to each other, this is how we're doing, because you want to know. So again, my promise to you is I'm not going to talk about these next several weeks. You're going to get an email tomorrow from me, which is kind of a fun email. It's a no-holds-bar interview with Pastor Tim that we're going to send out tomorrow that will summarize the things I'm talking about today. And then after that, I just want you to pray about it. And I'm convinced that if we pray about it and listen, we're going to take the second path. And rather than Pastor Tim having to talk about money all the time, I'm going to talk about how generous we are, and look what we just did this week to change the world. That's a lot more fun for me, and I'm hoping it's a lot more fun for you. So let me close with one final story. It's a story from the Bible. Many of you know this story. Jesus is sitting in the temple in their church, and he's watching people give the offering. And at that point, what they used to do is everybody would just walk up and they'd drop their offerings in sort of in front of everybody, which I think is a great idea. It's called peer pressure. And so he's watching, and people are dropping in various amounts of money, some large gifts, some smaller gifts. And then he watches a widow, an elderly woman, a widow, and she walks up, and all she has is what we call a widow's mite. It's about the size of that hole right there. It's the smallest coin you can mint. It's absolutely worthless. She puts that in the offering plate, and Jesus says, now that's an offering. That'll change the world. That's significant. Because everybody else was giving out of their abundance. But she was giving out of her need. That was reckless generosity. And that's the generosity that'll change the world. So some of you are thinking to yourselves, look, Tim, we'd like to support the church, but right now we're on a fixed income, or we're so broke you just can't imagine. The only way you get out of debt is to start to give your way out of debt. It doesn't make sense, and that's why God asks us to do it. You can give $1 a week. You can give 50 cents a week. You can give 1% or 10% or 12%, whatever God asks you to give. So why not us? Let's be that kind of church.